Vanishing Point, Las Vegas, in August of 2003, was a city bustling with tourists, lights, and the promise of excitement around every corner. But for 19-year-old Jodi Marie Brewer, the city held a different kind of allure. She had arrived in Las Vegas from a small town, hoping to carve out her future among the neon lights, finding work and making connections in the world of entertainment. On the morning of August 6th, Jodi made plans to meet friends. She was lively, full of promise, and always eager for the next adventure. But as the day turned to night and Jodi failed to show up at a planned meeting, her friends grew concerned. A quick look at her phone, her social media, and other communication methods revealed she had not been in touch with anyone. The silence was unsettling. The following day, her family reported her missing. They told the police that Jodi was independent, but not the type to vanish without a word. Her absence was out of character, and the authorities launched a missing persons investigation. Family and friends spread flyers, contacted anyone who might have information, and scoured her usual hangouts. But weeks passed, and no solid leads emerged. A sense of dread slowly gripped those who loved her, as it became clear that something far more sinister was at play. The clock was ticking, and every minute without answers seemed to deepen the mystery of Jodi's disappearance. Frantic search. The hunt for Jodi intensified as weeks turned into months. Authorities mobilized a full-scale search operation. Volunteers scoured the outskirts of Las Vegas, as well as nearby desert areas, searching for any trace of the missing young woman. But despite all the efforts, Jodi's trail remained eerily cold. Her cell phone had been turned off, and there were no signs of a struggle or any clues as to where she could have gone. Her family was beside themselves with worry, and the community, too, was growing increasingly fearful. Days turned into weeks without any significant leads, and the police were faced with a growing sense of desperation. Jodi's relationships were closely examined. Both her family and friends were interviewed repeatedly. A few details about her life raised eyebrows. There was mention of a troubled ex-boyfriend, a man who had a history of emotional outbursts. This individual, once a figure in Jodi's life, was questioned by the authorities. But despite his rocky past with Jodi, he denied any involvement in her disappearance. His alibi checked out, and he was soon cleared as a suspect. Another name emerged, a man who had been a casual acquaintance of Jodi's, known to have a violent temper. He was also questioned, but nothing linked him to the crime, and he too was let go. As each lead dissolved into nothing, the search for answers seemed even more futile, and the haunting question lingered: where was Jodi Brewer? A desert discovery. The case remained stagnant until a breakthrough came from an unexpected place. On October 17th, a hiker exploring a remote section of the Mojave Desert near San Bernardino made a grisly discovery. Stumbling upon a dark green duffel bag, the hiker cautiously opened it, only to find the dismembered torso of a woman inside. Shocked, the hiker quickly alerted the authorities. The body was soon identified as Jodi Brewer. The discovery, miles away from Las Vegas in an area known for its desolation, sent waves of shock through Jodi's family, her community, and the investigating officers. The question was now clear. How had Jodi's body ended up in the desert, so far from where she was last seen? Was she killed somewhere else, and her body dumped in the desert as a final act of cruelty? The authorities began combing the area for any signs of the killer. With no head, no arms, and no legs, the torso alone could offer little in terms of forensic evidence. But the location itself, the remote desert, seemed to suggest a careful disposal, not a random dump. Whoever had done this had gone to great lengths to hide the body. Desert of secrets. The discovery of Jodi's body in such a remote location raised numerous questions. The authorities knew the desert had to have been chosen carefully, but why? The desert terrain was vast, a desolate expanse of sand and rock. Why would the killer risk traveling there, miles away from the safety of civilization? No vehicle tracks were found at the scene, leading investigators to suspect the killer might have been familiar with the area, someone who could navigate the barren landscape without drawing attention. The question arose whether Jodi's death had been planned or was a result of a spontaneous act of violence. Investigators quickly realized that Jodi's death wasn't a random killing. The dismemberment of her body indicated a degree of planning and calculation that seemed at odds with an impulsive murder. Her torso had been carefully placed in the duffel bag and left in a location where it might never be found. Police considered the possibility that the person who had killed Jodi knew the desert well, either as a resident or someone accustomed to its vast emptiness. Could the killer have been someone from Las Vegas? Or did the crime happen elsewhere, perhaps during a trip Jodi had made? The more they explored these possibilities, the more the case seemed to deepen into a labyrinth of unanswered questions. Investigation begins. With the grim discovery now in the hands of law enforcement, detectives intensified their efforts to understand who might have wanted to harm Jodi. Investigators took a hard look at the people closest to her. Her family, friends, and acquaintances were all questioned. Jodi had led a relatively normal life, working in a local restaurant, socializing with friends, and maintaining a modest social media presence. Her family spoke highly of her, calling her a kind and compassionate young woman with no known enemies. But in a deeper dive into her social circle, police discovered that Jodi had dated a number of men, some of whom had less than innocent backgrounds. One particular ex-boyfriend came under suspicion after police learned that the two had recently broken up under bitter circumstances. This man had a history of violence, though he had never been charged with anything serious, and was considered a potential suspect. He was questioned extensively, but no physical evidence connected him to the crime scene. His alibi for the night Jodi disappeared checked out, and he was ultimately cleared. The same process repeated with other ex-boyfriends, one by one, all of whom had either alibis or provided information that led nowhere. At the same time, police turned their attention to individuals who had known Jodi more casually. There was mention of a man who worked at a bar Jodi frequented, a man with a criminal record. He was considered a suspect after surveillance footage revealed he had been working the night Jodi disappeared. Yet after hours of questioning, it was clear that he was merely a figure in her life with no real connection to her disappearance. He was eventually let go, but the frustration of not having a solid lead was beginning to mount. Each cleared suspect seemed to move the case further away from a resolution, leaving investigators to wonder if the killer was someone completely outside of Jodi's social circle. A quiet town's dark secrets. As the investigation continued, investigators turned their attention to potential connections that might not have been immediately obvious. They began to look into people Jodi had encountered casually, both in Las Vegas and in the surrounding areas. A troubling pattern began to emerge. Some of Jodi's acquaintances were known to have troubling histories, with violent tendencies and a history of aggressive behavior. One particular man, a figure from her past, had a criminal record of violence and a string of failed relationships. His name came up during the investigation after police discovered that he had been in contact with Jodi in the months leading up to her disappearance. This man, a former co-worker, had been in and out of trouble with the law for years. He had a violent temper and was known to lash out without provocation. Police were keen to investigate further, but every attempt to track him down was fruitless. Several interviews with people who knew him revealed contradictory statements about his whereabouts during the time of Jodi's disappearance. Despite a wealth of circumstantial evidence, there was no smoking gun to link him directly to the crime. He was questioned, but his alibi was solid, and without any concrete evidence, he was eventually cleared as a suspect. His dismissal left the investigators further frustrated, knowing that the killer was still out there, but with no tangible leads to follow. The first break. After months of investigative stagnation, the first significant break in the case came when a witness, a local resident, reported seeing a suspicious vehicle near the desert area where Jodi's body had been discovered. The witness described a dark-colored SUV parked along the side of the road, with a man standing near the vehicle. The witness could not recall the specific make or model of the car, but the description of the man seemed eerily familiar to investigators. He was described as having a tall, thin build and dark hair. This was the first solid lead in months, and the police quickly zeroed in on the vehicle, tracing local records for any dark SUVs that might have been in the area at the time. Yet, the lead quickly ran cold. The SUV's ownership was difficult to trace, and the man remained a ghost, his identity still a mystery. The silent witness. The breakthrough in the case was followed by another moment of hope when a second witness came forward, claiming to have seen the same suspicious vehicle near the desert area where Jodi's body had been discovered. This second witness, who had not been aware of the first witness's testimony, provided a remarkably similar description of the vehicle and the man standing by it. The fact that two independent witnesses had seen the same vehicle at different times was compelling, but the lack of hard evidence to connect the man to Jodi's murder kept investigators in the dark. The police followed up on the information, interviewing anyone who might have seen the vehicle or the man, but the lead continued to be frustratingly vague. Who was this man, and why was he in the desert that day? The mystery surrounding him grew deeper with each passing day. The autopsy. Months after Jodi's body was found, the results of the autopsy provided some chilling insights. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma, likely from a heavy object. No signs of sexual assault were found, which led investigators to believe that the motive for the murder was not related to sexual violence, but something more personal. Defensive wounds on Jodi's arms suggested that she had fought back, struggling against her attacker. Yet, there were no obvious signs of a weapon. No blunt object was found near the scene, and no fingerprints were discovered on the body. This left investigators with few options. The absence of a weapon was puzzling. Could the killer have taken the weapon with him? Was it something untraceable? The police were left to contemplate the nature of the crime and whether Jodi had known her attacker. Was it someone who had stalked her, or was it a random act of violence by a stranger? Searching for patterns. As the investigation continued, the detectives began to look for patterns in other unsolved cases, hoping to find something that might link Jodi's murder to a wider trend of violence. They examined unsolved disappearances and killings in both Nevada and California, searching for connections. One theory they explored was the possibility that Jodi's killer had a history of violence, someone who had perhaps committed similar crimes in the past. But the more they looked into these cases, the more they realized that there were no clear patterns to be found. Each lead they followed seemed to dissipate quickly, leaving only more uncertainty. Even as new forensic methods became available, the case remained painfully stagnant. Every attempt to connect the dots between various unsolved crimes led to more frustration and dead ends. A moment of hope. Finally, after years of investigation, the case saw a brief resurgence when a former friend of Jodi's came forward, claiming to know the identity of the person who had killed her. This new lead promised to break the case wide open. The friend revealed that Jodi had confided in him just days before her disappearance about a troubled encounter with a man she had met online. The suspect was a stranger who had seemed normal at first, but soon displayed unsettling behavior. However, the lead, while promising, once again failed to produce results. After multiple interviews and a thorough investigation into the suspect, it was clear that the man was not involved in Jodi's death. He was soon cleared of any wrongdoing. The case remained unsolved, the killer still unknown. The cold case. As the years passed, Jodi Brewer's case slowly faded into the background. It became a cold case, filed away in the back rooms of law enforcement, awaiting a breakthrough. Yet her family never gave up hope. They kept Jodi's memory alive, holding annual vigils and keeping the case alive through media outreach. Despite the lack of answers, the people who loved Jodi refused to stop searching for the truth. And though the killer's identity remained a mystery, the story of Jodi Brewer's tragic death continued to haunt the community. Her case remained a reminder of how fleeting life could be and how easily a person could disappear without a trace. The haunting question lingered: who killed Jodi Brewer and why?